Good afternoon. I did prepare a written paper, and I think that in order to make it in the short time we have, I will more or less read the paper. I like better to talk to people, but that won't allow me to go through with it. I wrote a small introduction to explain that my own Yom Kippur War trauma is what made me into a narrative scholar, because until then I did little experimental studies which were published in very good journals, and I received my tenure, etc. And it's an interesting autobiographical point that I'm making. I felt I have to do something meaningful after the war or during the war. So that's a result now of almost 40 years of doing qualitative research, and in other words, sitting and listening to stories that people are telling me. And my first and most important conclusion is that the stories people tell about the past are formed by the present, that they change over time. And I want to base my very general conclusions on some of my important projects that were summarized in these books that you have now. The first one in 1978 is really based on the Yom Kippur War of 1973 and its aftermath. And then there is a book about the kibbutz, which is also an old classic now, but it deals with some aspects that are traumatic in kibbutz life and were not part of the discourse at that time. That's my whole point, that the discourse changes. Then there is the book about my POWs, the prisoners of war, that I've studied, and it appeared in English in 1994. This will be the major source for my work. For more than 30 years, I've been interviewing Israeli Jews, not Arabs, to answer questions that I'm always asked, in a variety of settings and communities, and writing about them or about us. In my open-ended interviews, I usually ask my participants to construct a subjective story about their identity and reality, and I receive autobiographical stories of different kinds. More often than not, I saw that the stories I'm being told are pain discourse. They deal with pain. I will not use the word trauma if I don't have to, because it is such a matter of how you define it, and subjectivity and objectivity. But pain is something we all understand. The stories that I call pain discourse can be characterized as having a chapter, at least, but a major chapter, an important chapter of the book, of the story, as involving a description of the bad times, the rough times that I experienced. Almost always the story involved instances of loss, deprivation, due to the wars, to the Holocaust, to immigration, to poverty, and in the kibbutz due to the severity of upbringing, which was partly ideological during the formative years of the growing kibbutz. There are many instances of this which I will bring as we go along. As a result of this, most of the stories that people tell me have 3 chapters, and the chapters are outlined here. The first chapter is life before something terrible happened, life before the bad times. Then there is the major part that I refer to, which is a disaster, the terrible times, and we'll see that Aristo is calling it peripeteia. And then there is a last chapter, the third chapter, which sometimes involves the longest period of time, and this is my life since this bad time. They can often be drawn, these three chapters, as having a U form, with this form, with a long stretch of coping and recovery, which brings the narrators to the present moment in the story, usually ending with a positive, even celebratory note. This should not entirely surprise any of us if we study Jerome Bruner and his contribution to narrative inquiry. Bruner, who refers to Aristo and Poetics, said that every good story has to have a break or a fall so that people will be able to grasp the story and to remember it. It takes the expulsion of Adam and Eve from paradise or of Snow White from the palace to create a good story that will be retold, remembered for generations and ages. So in normal people's stories, we need a sudden reversal of circumstances that happens in the past, sometimes in the very far past of childhood, something later during my military service, or during something that happened in adulthood. Although this is not the topic of this paper, let me just share with you a finding that in Israeli Jewish stories, the bad times, the blow or the reversal are almost always collective, a collective calamity, a war or the Holocaust. It's very rarely in my Israeli stories, and I tell you very rarely, that this will be a family, break, my father died or my parent divorced, or this kind of individual type of break. And here I'm reaching the focus of my paper. When I'm studying the second chapter, this will be our topic because we deal with trauma discourse. In the above model of 3 chapters, I actually look at the place and nature of trauma discourse in Israeli people's life narratives. Listening to their exact words and subjective constructions in my interview data, it appears to me that major changes have occurred through the last 4 decades and can be extrapolated for the entire history of Israel as a state. The concept of trauma is almost entirely absent in the stories of my interviewees until 1990. It emerged in the 1990s and is gaining in frequency since, but not in all segments of society, as I'll explain later. Referring to the early stories, not only is the concept of trauma non-existent, but the narratives reveal very little, if any, weak spots in one's life. Pain is presented as a challenge to be met and mastered by the narrator's agency to demonstrate individual strengths, cleverness, or good luck of the men and women who had experienced it. Like in the famous slogan about the full or empty half of one's glass of water, so did these life stories of very tough circumstances in the earlier stage of Israeli history underscore coping rather than suffering or loss. In counterpoint, the concept of heroism, which were at their peak in the middle of the 20th century, have gradually disappeared from public and private discourse. This discourse shift that we can generally call from the discourse of heroes to the discourse of victims, these discourse shifts are most prevalent in narratives of men than in those of women, but both genders manifest the same trend. They can be demonstrated in many instances of my own and my colleagues' studies in Israel. The three main studies that I will use for my talk are, as I mentioned, the research about prisoners of war that spent 3.5 to 4 years in jail in Egypt and were returned to Israel in 1973. So there is now 37 or so years of repeated stories about the same events. Then there is an ongoing study about immigration that I'm collecting, and some of it comes from my students. And there is a specific study that I think teaches us by negation, which is about the survivor of a religious kibbutz that was almost totally destroyed, and most of the male grown-ups were killed in 1948. So if we have time, and if you will be interested, we can provide more details about the studies, but we are short of time. So if you look at these studies, you see that trauma is not part of the old stories, and it suddenly emerges as we hear the stories in the last 20 years. So, of course, what I'm trying to say is the concept of trauma is subjectivity. It has to do with subjectivity rather than with history, and I think that is a major point. When we ask ourselves what forms a story or what forms a trauma discourse, I think that in a very simple manner we can talk about three factors. What really happened? Namely, I jumped off this airplane and I was captured and captivated and put in prison, etc. These are facts. What are the facts? Then there is the teller, the narrator, who is using memory and has special interest and motivation to tell this story rather than the other story. Every one of us know that we can make selection in the many memories we have and form one story rather than the other according to the motivation we have at the moment. And then there is the culture and the language which is prevalent at the time of telling. And this relates now to political, social, economical, or religious climate at the time of telling. And the three factors interact to create together a changing discourse, a changing narrative. Even if the narrators are consciously committed to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth as they are required by the justice system, they cannot avoid being influenced by the second and third factors that you see above. In other words, a complex network of social, political, historical, and cultural factors, or rather polarities, accounts for the transition in trauma discourse, and this is what I would like to prove in the next few moments. What are really the changes in one of the three factors that I had above, or mostly the cultural changes that can account for this different trauma discourse? So the difference between the trauma about heroes, between the narrative about heroes to the narrative about trauma and victimhood. The first factor, and I can tell you that all Israelis will agree, is that in the first years of the establishment of the state and the very young army, the myth of the hero was among the formative ideas of the new society and constructed the ideal of the new Jewish male. So we all loved heroes and told hero story. In reaction to the traditional stereotype of the Jew, who was an intellectual or a commerce person, but rarely a man of physical strength, The new Israeli culture emphasized bodybuilding and strength for the young male Israelis. The farmer and the soldier were at the top of the occupational pyramid. Courage and physical endurance were crucial elements in the new ideal. Heroism was closely linked to patriotism. The image of the hero embraced also men who were killed in battle, that we call in Hebrew noflim, the fallen, in defense of the country. Weakness, as a central attribute of the old Jewish male stereotype, was scorned and devalued. And if you think about the Holocaust, it is a good parallel that I don't have time to discuss. Thus, the POWs who recounted their experience during the early 1980s constructed them mainly as heroic narratives. Their heroism included elements of not breaking down under torture and not giving away any of the state confidential military information in their interrogation. To be weak was shameful, and if experienced, was simply deleted out of one's memory and discourse. In the later years of the 20th century, Israelis as individual or the entire army are not judged anymore as outstanding heroes, and this is not the ideal anymore. So I think that this inflation in heroism has influenced the way my POWs repeat the stories as the years go by. The second factor is the dialectics of a perpetrator versus a victim. Following the immense input of the Holocaust, the new Israeli was educated around the idea of survival. It meant, among other things, never to become a victim, or in the famous idiom, never to go a sheep to be slaughtered. You should fight back, was a lesson taught. So unbearable was the humiliation of victimhood for Israelis that it was repressed and suppressed in their account of their own bad times, like captivity or immigration. The position of the perpetrator, with all the moral dilemmas inherent in it, was preferable to that of the victim. Only years later were moral qualms about some of the means of survival during the Holocaust even, or the Israeli occupation, allowed into private and public discourse, and sensitivity to pain and suffering entered the public arena. These two factors, the heroism and this is the one I'm discussing now, in combination made some space available for the discourse of weakness and pain in Israeli culture and facilitated its emergence. People could talk about the flaws. Even weeping male soldiers became legitimate. In parentheses, I want to tell you that we cannot dismiss the relevance of gender and the place of feminine discourse in the culture as part of these processes, but again, I will not have time to talk about it. The third factor is individualism versus collectivism. It's quite acceptable in social studies that the Israeli society is gradually moving from a collectivistic to individualistic society. And so, when the collective values were dominant, the private suffering of an individual was secondary to the goals and ideals of the collective. Patriotism, namely loyalty to the state, implied denial of individual hardships. People in the early kibbutz, for example, were not allowed to dwell upon their pain and deprivation, since their suffering was considered as a means to a sacred end. Moreover, people in the collectivistic era manifested absolute trust in the society ideology, in our local institution, and in the integrity and wisdom of our leaders. The discourse of trauma emerged when these beliefs gradually collapsed. An individual felt alienation and growing suspicion toward the system. It surfaced when people realized that they had to confront their hardships single-handed. D is a very unpleasant point to bring up because I have so much empathy to all victims of all kinds. But I think when Freud talked about secondary gains, he was very, very clever. Without enlarging upon this sensitive point, I was attacked several times in previous lectures, so I'm careful. I think that we agree that when society provides compensation for disability and suffering, more people will come forward and claim it. This makes some people refer to their past experience as trauma, even if they did not do so before. I have many cases to prove this point. They are very painful and I cannot repeat them in public. Next point, which changes the discourse, and I'm getting to the end, is the prevalence of medical terminology. With exposure to many more books and to movies and television shows, which use the term trauma and show treatment of trauma, people have become much more medically sophisticated and use the same terminology. I think it's not a random event that some of my POWs mention Yoram Yovel's book on psychopathology as a transition point in their own self-perception. And not the books that I wrote about them that was absolutely non-medical. So people are more prone today to use this kind of trauma discourse because it's simply more available. The next point is very interesting because it negates almost all that I've said so far. While all these factors may explain the emergence of trauma discourse in Israeli society, one of my studies seemed to teach us an important lesson by negation. The second generation of Kfar Etzion people, who could be considered as surely having a trauma in the past, are not talking about their early, the loss of their fathers, the loss of their homes, the terrible circumstances that occur later, never talk about it as trauma, although I interviewed them in the last 7-8 years. So how come they do not use the trauma discourse, although they belong to the same cultures at the same time? And my answer, again, very, very briefly, is that their religious beliefs, they are all religious people, Orthodox religious. Their religious beliefs and practices provide meaning and framework to their past inflictions and losses. Their fathers are framed as martyrs, for example, and they themselves are people who carry the load of the Israel future on their shoulders. הם אומרים, אנחנו מגש הכסף, זה אנחנו. That is a very famous line from a famous Israeli poet. Such beliefs make the utilization of trauma discourse inappropriate and even unnecessary. They have another way to explain what happened to them. So a broader conclusion from this study on Kfar Etzion might be that with a secularization of society, trauma discourse may probably increase, or the opposite, if the religious sides will be more popular. Finally, the last factor from the major ones that I can very briefly bring here is the age of the narrators. If I'm talking, for example, about the POWs, they started to tell me their stories when they were in their early 40s or mid-40s, and now they are in their 70s. And life is doing things to people, not only mellowing them, but really giving them diseases and all kinds of losses, which help to maybe open up and see the past also under the same light. The repeated interviews with the same narrators over the years have shown me how some of the people simply age into talking about trauma in their past. I think it's a very nice, interesting configuration, and I have one quote from one of my POWs in 2001, which is certainly in society, the trauma discourse already very popular. For the first time, this man who always told me the heroic story says, all my life I feel like a swimmer who tries to reach his goal with a cadaver tied to his leg. This man, by the way, went into psychotherapy and was greatly helped by it. He did it in his late 60s, not before. So to conclude, I think that in Israel, trauma discourse has undergone a significant process of change, and this may have some general conclusions also for other society. So to see the past as something that is fixed over there in history books is, of course, a mistake. The present moment transforms the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amia Lieblich. We have very short for questions, 5 minutes, my colleague told me. If anyone, please.
Just a question. Some of the points you showed how over time, over Israel's history, certain conceptual patterns or governing concepts like heroism, like collectivism, went down, and with the rise of trauma and individualism. And I was wondering if ever in your interviews you encountered people who resisted categories as such, that were against not just categories of the state or categories of the person before the state, but were just disillusioned with any kind of categorization at all. That is something. Or that they always fell into a conceptual scheme.
Look, this is my conceptual scheme. That people tell stories, that people give me examples, they talk about events, they talk about feelings. And when I allow myself to try to generalize from them, that's what I see. But certainly I think that individualism is very prevalent, and it's not just a concept that we scholars are, projecting over our interviewees.
Thank you. Any more? Yes, please.
You started telling us that your trauma in the Kippur War initiated or jump-started your research into trauma. Has it projected
into stories, not into
Sorry?
Into stories. Into doing narrative research. Yes.
Have you noticed whether your experience or your experiencing the trauma of Kippur has been projected on your interviewees, and in what way? Like, transference, counter-transference, taking the jargon of psychoanalysis. Has it ever occurred to you that you are doing something with your own trauma experience, projecting it on your interviewees?
I resist the temptation to use these concepts. My scholarship is taking the point that the stories people tell are their narrative truths. And the stories I hear are what there is. Of course, the context changes. Also, my relationship to them changes. But the idea about projection is really far alien to my perspective about life story research. There are different kinds of doing hermeneutics. There is a hermeneutics of suspicion in which you always look at what is behind the story. What way does the scholar or the interviewer really say something unintentionally? What is there that is hidden? I'm not looking at the hidden. I'm looking at what is up in the surface, and this is what I based my research on. But you are right that my own change in the type of academic work I did after the Yom Kippur War was well known, but I didn't look for special war stories or suffering stories. I looked for Israeli stories, when I did the kibbutz or when I did the immigration. My last project is about theater in Israel, theater, community theaters. It's not that I bring my own agenda. I think I bring my listening part.
Don't you invite certain stories and discard other stories that could have been told to you?
No, not consciously.
Thank you. Thank you, Amia.